Yeah, no, it's over there.
I only have like 20 of them, so I just kind of like...
Good morning. My name is Luisa Blanco, and I am an economics professor at the School of Public Policy. It is a pleasure for us to have Dr. Jerry Ellig with us. This lecture has been made possible by the generosity of the Koch Charitable Foundation. Dr. Ellig is currently a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. He worked as a deputy director and acting director of the Office of Policy Planning at the Federal Trade Commission, and served as a senior economist for the Joint Economic Committee of the United States Congress. Dr. Ellig also worked as an assistant professor of economics at George Mason University, where he earned his PhD and his master's in economics. Dr. Ellig has published articles on government regulation and business management in scholarly journals and popular periodicals, such as the Journal of Regulatory Economics, Managerial and Decision Economics, Antitrust Bulletin, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. He has co-authored and edited several books titled Dynamic Competition and Public Policy, New Horizons in Natural Gas Deregulation, and Municipal Entrepreneurship and Energy Policy. Dr. Ellig's lecture will give us an overview on how regulation affects our daily lives, what regulatory changes have we seen in the last decades, and what changes are we going to see as a result of the financial crisis. The discussion is relevant since regulation has a significant impact on incentives for individuals and businesses. Please join me to welcome Dr. Ellig.
Oh, well, thank you, Professor Blanco, for the introduction, and more importantly, for the invitation. This is a beautiful place to visit. In fact, she almost lost me this morning because I was out in the garden wandering around, and she didn't know I was out there. But in any case, given the topic that I've been asked to talk about today, I'd like to start with a question. Do you feel regulated?
Yes.
Okay, some people say yes, some people say no. Let me tell you how my day started. I was awakened this morning, not by the alarm clock, but by my phone, because my wife gave me a call. And of course, for that call to be able to go through on a cell phone, the phone company had to buy a license to use part of the radio spectrum in order to deliver that, buy a license from the Federal Communications Commission, and there are various regulations and rules attached to how that spectrum can be used and what the phone company can do with it. After I was awake, I got out of bed. By the way, I was on a mattress, and I started looking around the room for citations to the Code of Federal Regulation, because that's what you do when you study regulation. And so I found one very quickly because I knew what it would look. I checked the tag on the mattress, and the tag on my mattress assured me that the mattress complies with 16 CFR Port 1633, which is part of the Code of Federal Regulations that deals with flame retardant and fireproof mattresses. So that was comforting. Apparently that's why the tag is there. It also told me what the mattress was made out of. Then I got up and went into the bathroom and took out my FDA-approved toothbrush and put FDA-approved toothpaste on and brushed my teeth. Next thing I did was reach for the shaving cream, which was only a 2.5-ounce container because I flew here, and regulations from the Department of Homeland Security tell me that I'm not allowed to carry a full-size can of shaving cream on the airplane. Now, I'm not necessarily complaining about all this. The cell phone company had to get a license to use the spectrum. They bought it at an auction run by the FCC. That's actually been a much better way of allocating spectrum than some of the methods the FCC previously used. I think I like the idea of sleeping on a mattress that's flame retardant, so I'm not sure I mind that regulation very much. And, toothpaste and toothbrushes, I could probably figure that out on my own. I don't know if I mind the one about the shaving cream. I'm not sure how much safer this has made me as an airline passenger, and I'm not sure if the Department of Homeland Security considered that when they decided to adopt that regulation. So that one, I'd like to know what information they looked at until I told you whether I like that one or not. But the general point, I'm not saying this stuff to complain, my general point is simply that federal regulation touches our everyday lives in many ways that we never bother to think about, but it's extremely pervasive. And so it makes sense to learn more about how it works, what it does, and think carefully when we adopt adopt new regulations or when we review old ones. Let me define a little more carefully, though, what I'm talking about. A lot of times in casual conversation, we all use the term regulation to refer to any kind of a restriction imposed by the government that tells me what I can or can't do, and so forth. But regulation actually means something a little more specific than that. Regulation occurs when a legislature, at least in the U.S., when a legislature delegates some of its lawmaking power to a regulatory agency, which then issues detailed rules that are supposed to carry out the intention of the legislature. Now, I'm not a lawyer. I'm a non-attorney spokesperson. So if there's anybody from the law school here, you may tell me that I didn't get that definition quite right, but the basic idea, I think, is right, that a regulation is something issued by a regulatory agency which is supposed to be filling in the gaps as a result of legislation that was passed by the legislature, in the case of federal regulation, of course, the U.S. Congress. There are two kinds of regulatory agencies on the federal level in the United States. A lot of regulatory agencies are actually part of the executive branch, and their top officials are hired and also can be fired by the president. The Environmental Protection Agency, the various agencies that regulate transportation within the Department of Transportation, the Federal Railroad Administration, the Surface Transportation Board, the National Highway Traffic Safety Commission, various agencies inside the Department of Transportation. Anything that's in a cabinet department, plus a number of other things, are regulatory agencies that are directly responsible to the president. There are also these things called independent regulatory agencies that, well, they're independent of the president, they're not so independent of Congress. These are usually things with the name commission in their name. The president typically appoints the commissioners who run these agencies with the consent of the Senate, but then he can't fire them. And these agencies, as a result, tend to be more independent of the president, though not necessarily of Congress, since Congress ultimately approves the budget and writes the laws that the agencies are supposed to implement. And those kind of agencies are things like the Federal Communications Commission, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, as I said, most things with commission in their names. Securities and Exchange Commission, Commodity Futures Trading Commission. The Federal Reserve is also considered an independent agency. And the big difference between the independent agencies and the executive agencies is the executive agencies are supposed to play by a certain set of rules laid out in executive orders that have been issued both in Democratic and Republican administrations that explain how they are supposed to analyze regulations in order to justify them. And the White House has the ability to tell these agencies, no, you can't issue that regulation because you haven't done your homework. The independent agencies, on the other hand, have not traditionally been subject to that kind of oversight by the White House. There is a sort of organized process for making regulations, and don't worry, the boring stuff will be over in a minute. Just as background, I wanted to give you this. There is a sort of organized process for issuing regulations. A regulatory agency can't simply go off and do whatever it wants. There has to be some sort of grounds in legislation for the regulatory agency to do it, so it has to be empowered to issue this particular regulation by Congress. The agency typically has to issue a proposed regulation for public comment, and the agency will typically take public comments for 60 to 90 days on the proposed regulation. Then the agency rewrites the proposed regulation, issues a final regulation. It may go through several rounds of proposals and revisions and so forth. If the agency is an executive agency, the